So this is a video for a short demonstration on how to use pivot tables and pivot charts in Excel. So what we're looking at here is a spreadsheet that has some crash data for Trent and Spokane Falls Boulevard. It's a pretty small data set. It has only 47 crashes, so it goes to row 48, and lots of different variables. So you can see it has lots of tables, or lots of columns, sorry. And one of the things in why it's so useful for crash data is, one, you can have lots and lots of crash data. This is a pretty small data set, but you sometimes have tens of thousands, if not more, of crash data that you're trying to quickly analyze. And with pivot tables, it's really quick to create summary tables and charts where if you're kind of exploring the descriptive statistics of your data set, trying to figure out what is sort of the compelling pieces of information, you'll be able to see in this demonstration how quickly you can kind of search through, and it's far easier than doing sorts and counts and creating count if statements and other things that you might have been using to look at Excel data. So first we're going to look at just a pivot table, and then afterwards we'll kind of look at also pivot charts. So to create a pivot table, it's just under the Insert menu, and you'll see over here this pivot table function or icon. So when you create it, the first thing it's going to ask is what the extents of your data. Usually it tries to find, it does a pretty good job at sort of selecting all the data. So it's looking from cell A1 over to column CL down to 48. So if I am concerned that it's not picking up on my columns, I can kind of I can go to the end and see, but we'll see that it's seeing all the rows and columns that have data in it. You can create the tables that it creates. You can put it in your existing worksheet. You'll see that this spreadsheet has just a single worksheet where the data is. I'm going to put it in a new one, or if you do existing, then you just tell it where it wants. But to avoid overriding information, I'm just going to put it there. So it creates a new worksheet. I could go back and name it something. But anyway, you get this object that goes in here about pivot table. This one says pivot table 3, because actually I've been messing around with this spreadsheet before and had already created a couple pivot tables. But over in here is the, on the right side is the functionality. So it looked, because the data that I had column headings, so it noticed that, and so it created essentially variables out of each column heading and whatnot. So if the first thing I might be interested in is how many crashes occur per year. So if I look and I put the year by row, you'll see that right away, as soon as it creates in that object, it put all the years and also had a total. But this is just setting the first column, but maybe what I'm concerned with is actually a count. So I want to take, if I'm just trying to count the number of crashes that occurred, I would want to pick a set, a variable that I knew didn't have any missing data. If you remember back from the very beginning when I quickly scrolled through, a lot of those later columns didn't have information in all of them. So anyway, I'm actually going to pick report number, because that's a unique number for every crash. And so if I put it down here in values, it's actually going to look at that, and it created a count, right? And so it tells me how many crashes I have per year. I could also go into that and hit that down arrow and change it. Now this isn't going to mean anything, crash numbers. I could try to sum it. Anyway, so they'll treat those values and just add them up. I actually down here in some of these other years have a lot of numbers stored as text, so that's why it looks a little strange there. But you can kind of scroll through, and there are lots of things like figuring out the standard deviation, averages and whatnot. You can also change the number format. But here I just want to know counts, so I can see how many crashes that occurred each year. So anyway, for looking at years, it was able to do something pretty quick, but it wouldn't have really been that hard, especially with only 47 crashes to come up with all that information. But really the power of the pivot tables is being able to sort of drill further down into the information. So what if I was interested in not just what was happening per year, but what was happening per month? So down here, I'm going to, sorry, it's kind of a small thing. I'll hit, if I do it by month, right, you'll see that in each year I'll also have by month. If I were to remove the field for month and just leave, or for year and just leave month, right? But as long as I have two of them in the row column, sorry, the way that makes the videos, it kind of only wants me to show one at the same time, but you can see that it's including both of them. So then in addition to having rows, I can also have columns. So if what I was interested in was maybe injury type as well, so once I add a column, so I still have my rows of years and months, but now I see that I have three column levels, no injury, possible injury, and suspected. There's actually more injury types, but fortunately on the street there hasn't been any serious injuries or fatal crashes. So with the column labels, I get the filtering that you probably have used within Excel, where I can start limiting my results by one of the categories, or selecting all and showing all of them. So hopefully this shows how you quickly can kind of, just by dragging and dropping, you can kind of see patterns in your data really quickly and far less effort than you would go through. So you can imagine if you had tens or thousands of data sets that or rows, that how quickly and how useful this could be. There actually is even a feature, it's called Power Pivot Tables, where it leaves the data in an external database. And with Power Pivot Tables, you can actually create these with millions of observations. So the other thing I wanted to show you was how to create pivot charts. So back here on the insert menu, we looked at pivot table before. You can also create pivot charts. You can, by looking at this, I think what I typically do is create a pivot chart and a pivot table. So I'll show you that option. The pivot chart is similar, it just doesn't create the table as well. So I'm back here on the original data. It's still finding all my observations. I'm going to put it in a new worksheet, and in here you'll see that it also creates the pivot table. Now I'm up to pivot table 4, and next to it is the pivot chart. So I'm going to do something similar that I did last time. I'm going to have just year, and I'm going to go do the report number again, and it's going to default to count. So you can see it quickly just creates that chart. And so as I make changes over here, it updates my chart. So you can see how that's a lot faster than creating a traditional chart and changing the data sources and creating series and whatnot. With this, when you highlight on the chart part versus the table part, you'll see I can format the chart and do all the different colors. I can also do design. It's showing me all the different ways that I could do the line graphs, but similar to how just a regular chart in Excel, I can also change the chart type. So I can start looking and seeing the different ways I can view the data. So the last thing is what happens if you add more data. So a lot of times in crash data we'll create a spreadsheet like this, and then as maybe 6 months pass, we might get a new batch of data, and we would just sort of append it to the end of the crash rows that we have. So when you have that, when you highlight on the chart, or on the table or on the chart, you can either refresh if you've added additional data or you've changed a value. This just ensures that it goes back and looks at it. So if I were to go in here and change the value or override this, maybe new information, say that happened in 2008 instead of 2009, that refresh would actually change all this information. More likely, though, is you've appended a different additional data, and so you would just go and under the change the data source, I could go and maybe change this. Maybe I added 20 more records, and I could change this to 68, and it would automatically update all of the pivot tables or the pivot charts or whatever was linked in there. So by selecting that object, the same thing over here, right? I can change or change information about it and change the data source and refresh. So hopefully that's helpful, and something that you can use in not just on crash data, but essentially any kind of road data that you may have. So.